Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar this morning. My name is Steve Gill. I'm a managing partner at BTB Security, and we're presenting today on endpoint protection, discussing how it's more than just antivirus. And this is the first in what we'll have as a series of webinars that we'll continue to go through talking about different interesting topics in security and digital forensics. So again, thank you very much for joining today, and let's go ahead and get started. First, let's talk about BTB Security and who we are, where we came from. This is a company that was founded in 2006, and we're purely focused on information security and digital forensics. It's something that we live and breathe. We're very excited and passionate about. We have a lot of background in it. The four partners that work in the company are Brian Bailey, Chris McGinley, Ron Schlecht, and myself, Steve Gill. As you notice, we all have a lot of certifications, Certified Computer Examiner, CISSP, and so forth. But I think the primary thing is that we have a lot of background with practical experience. We have Big Four auditing experience. We've worked inside companies doing not only security consulting in the past, but also have had IT management, security management, all different types of jobs and backgrounds. It kind of lends to the practical recommendations that we give when we do our assessments or designs and so forth. So it's just a lot of interesting background, but then also we have a lot of passion and security about, or passion about security and digital forensics, and that's why we love doing what we do and why we want to be able to present like we are doing today. So going into the topic at hand, what's endpoint protection? A lot of people throw terms around that really don't describe what it means, and we wanted to talk about where it was back in the day and where it's going now. So let's take a look at the early 2000s, what people considered endpoint protection, and it's really just a very small thing that you saw back then, and it was primarily looking at antivirus. Antivirus has been around for a really long time, but it was still one of the primary things you would look at in terms of trying to protect the endpoint, whether that was a desktop or a laptop. You saw signatures being updated on a regular basis, but not very frequently. You would see maybe several times a week. You also would look and see routine scans being done, usually daily, of the disk and seeing if there were any viruses there, and then there was the memory management, looking at seeing if active applications running contain viruses. And then in the early 2000s, you also saw patch management coming to the forefront. When the Code Red worm came out, there was the need to see that we need to apply patches on systems, and it was typically a manual process. A new patch has been applied to a system, or new patch need to be applied to a system. You would go and download it and apply the patch, and sometimes it was successful, and sometimes it wasn't. And it was also a mishmash of, today we're releasing a new patch, tomorrow we're releasing another. It wasn't very regimented in terms of when you saw patches coming out, and it made it difficult to manage that process. So we're looking at applying patches, but not necessarily a patch management process. What is endpoint protection today? Now we're looking at not only having antivirus, but you're seeing signatures updated on a more regular basis. You have an automated patch management process. You also see that there's a typical window in which patches are released that gives companies and individuals the ability to look at and understand how they want to apply their patches and how it may affect their system. So the classic example was Patch Tuesday from Microsoft. You see that the new patches come out. You know that they're going to be coming out, and then you can apply that to your change management process, and it makes it easier to manage through that process. There's also host-based firewalls. You're looking at both inbound and inbound egress/ingress filtering, looking at how traffic is coming in and out of that system. That's in addition to what you're seeing on the network. So you're actually seeing host-based firewalls, along with at times host-based intrusion detection or intrusion prevention, and not only looking at signatures, but behavioral analysis. Some software is capable of saying, is this a typical behavior for an application, or is it doing something that's indicative of malware? And so if you're missing a signature, the software itself may actually be able to see and prompt the user, this is malicious, potentially malicious behavior. Do you know what's going on? And then log that event or stop the software from actually executing. Looking at full disk encryption. It's a very important part of managing any type of endpoint, especially when it's a mobile device, whether that's a laptop or a cell phone or a tablet. being able to protect the data at rest. So therefore, someone can't remove the storage and try to put it into another computer. So if someone stores sensitive information, they'd have to be able to enter a password to open the encryption key to get to that, to get to the data that's stored on the disk. To looking at data in motion, you're looking at data loss prevention or DLP software. And what that does is be able to do an analysis of files and data that's leaving the system, whether that's being sent via email, webmail, through file share, any type of networking, but then also plugging in devices into the computer and either putting policies in place that say if you're going to remove a file from the system and put it on a USB stick, do we want to just wholesale block it, or do you require the encryption software to then encrypt the file or the device that's being plugged into the system? And that's a policy-driven type of software. And lastly is sandboxing. And this typically applies more to your mobile devices such as your smartphones, PDAs, and tablets. And the idea is that in a situation in which it may be a personal device, but being used for company purposes also, that sandbox allows you to isolate the data and encrypt and keep it separated from the personal information. And examples of that are like Good Technologies, Mobile Iron, and so forth, contain email sandboxing and so forth. So that's where we're looking at endpoint protection today, and that's a lot of different technologies that are involved in there. But why the change? Why are we putting so many things on these devices nowadays? Well, first and foremost, there's an increasing mobile workforce. We're looking at more people telecommuting, whether that's from home or they're working in their local coffee shop or somewhere that there's free Wi-Fi. Even though travel has always been a part of it, with the power of devices today, there's just more telecommuting that happens for a user. So you're going to see things happening from hotel and airport, being able to access things after hours. So it's just a matter of being able to get to that information in a more readily available fashion, and therefore increasing the risk that data can be exposed. There's also been a higher rate of theft of devices, and a lot that's come to the forefront in terms of how much data has been out there. There's been laptops, hard drives stolen out of them, or the computer themselves being stolen, and it's been found that there's been social security numbers, credit card information, you name it, the data for end users has been there, and there's been a lot of state breach notification laws have been put in place that require disclosure. And it just comes to the forefront in terms of the level of increase of the data that's been stolen. And then also to raise the forefront of the increase in botnets and networked malware. When you have these things coming into prevalence, it puts people in a position where they say we need to protect these endpoints, and that's why these different types of software things have been put in place, which allows you to protect it. But at the same time, when we see more malware becoming sophisticated, communicating with each other and being able to allow attackers to propagate, you're going to see the defenses being raised too. When looking at compliance and reporting requirements, for example, PCI has requirements for protection of cardholder data, HIPAA with protecting health information, the state breach notification laws that I mentioned previously, and this is not a comprehensive list, but all the different regulations have different requirements in terms of trying to protect the data, and then also what the requirements are in terms of reporting if data was stolen off of a system. And as I mentioned previously with full disk encryption, if there is a theft of a system, when that's in place, typically that provides a safe harbor saying that the person who stole it couldn't have gotten it. And that's why you tend to see some of the software being put in place on these devices. But even with the advent of putting more mobile devices in people's hands, like smartphones, tablets, hybrid devices, like you're seeing your Microsoft Surface tablet now, these different devices do tend to make it easier to take it because it's smaller, it's powerful, but it still has all of the data that you would typically see on a laptop. So it's just more chance for people being able to take this information. And then with the advent of BYOD, or bring your own device, people don't want to carry a bunch of devices. They purchase their iPhone, they like to use it for themselves. Why can't they use it for work? So it's a lot of that type of conversation that comes up, and that's why different technologies are put in place like sandboxing. But to simply state that 4 walls and a central firewall can't always protect end users' devices, just for the reasons that I mentioned in the last 2 slides. We see people moving outside of the building, doing more work from the outside, not being inside the protection of the corporate facility and still trying to get their work done and trying to do it in a secure fashion. So there has to be these other things that are put in place in order to protect the end user. And what does this all mean? All those different technologies are meant to be put in a layered security. We're looking at defense in depth here. But the key point is that everything works together to reduce the risk of a breach. It's impossible to say we can 100% prevent a breach. However, we can do things to help reduce the risk that a breach occurs, or if someone were to break into a system, that we put these different layers in place, it gives us the ability to sense and respond appropriately in a time frame to reduce that risk exposure. So either reducing the risk of that actually happening or reducing that risk exposure. And how's that done? So, for example, when we talked about disk encryption, if you're doing an offline analysis of a hard drive or an alternate boot to try to get to the data since you can't log into the system, the disk encryption helps prevent that. When you're looking at data in transit for being able to have a system that's already booted and logged into, data loss prevention or the network protections such as firewall or host-based IDS helps prevent data from going back and forth off of the system. And then from a malicious code standpoint, that's where antivirus comes in place. And lastly, and probably most important, is the end user on the system. So there's a lot of technologies, but at the end, you're like, the end user? Do I really have to worry about the end user? And the answer is absolutely 100% yes. You do have to worry about the end user. And just a couple questions you can ask about it. What type of access do they have to their workstation? We do assessments all the time, and I will tell you that most organizations have their end users with administrator access to their own system. And that is a key point in what they can do. So, for example, if a user has local administrator access, they can install software. They can remove software. They may be able to disable things like antivirus. They may also be working off an image that has the same local administrator password as the person down on the next computer. And that person on the next computer could be an administrator for the domain. They could be a Unix administrator or a DBA, or they could be the person that has access to the HR files. So it doesn't necessarily have to be about administrative propagation as much as it is about access to sensitive data. So what access do they have to their own workstation? Can they disable this software? Are they the type of user that would open unsolicited emails and click links without thinking about where it's going? And what about the messages for host-based firewall? You may install these technologies, but give the user this granular control to authorize or not authorize applications to do things. So if you think about your end users, do they actually pop, when a window pops up and says, this application is trying to connect out to the internet to do this, first of all, do they even know what that means? And then do they just randomly click OK and let that happen? And what is the impact of that? And that's where user education comes in place, and wanting them to understand what they are doing on their systems could potentially be malicious. But they don't intend it to be that way. It's just a matter of IT, security, and the end users working together to help protect the system. So what are the pitfalls when looking at defense in depth and layering security? The whole point of layering these defenses is to allow one technology to cover the weakness of another. If you have an antivirus software that's very good at signature-based detection, but there's either a custom code created for your company in order to try to break in, or it's a zero-day exploit, antivirus isn't going to have a signature for that. So the control that would be in place would be a host-based firewall or intrusion detection system saying this is not allowed, this behavior is not allowed, this should be blocked. It's when you see those two layers fail, multiple layers fail, that breach attempts are successful. So if you have that customized Trojan horse that evades antivirus without having any type of egress filtering or behavior analysis, and the user just clicks OK, there's the connection that comes out. Ideally, it's inside a corporate environment, and then the company firewall or proxy blocks it. However, if they're in the coffee shop, they're telecommuting from home that day, and that happens, then it could potentially allow that breach to occur. So BTB actually created software that takes advantage of some of these failures, and we're going to do a demonstration of that. But we'll talk a little bit about how it works at first before we do the demonstration. So we developed a command and control bot. It's based off of, it's a customized Trojan horse, and it's known to evade antivirus. We actually use it on a lot of our penetration tests when we include social engineering testing. It is an example of using multiple layers of technology or processes that fail in order to be successful. So if you look at it, you're using XMPP over Jabber or over SSL, which is a Jabber protocol. It maintains persistence across reboots. It's not widely available because we control the distribution, as I mentioned. That's why it doesn't have the antivirus signatures that detect it. And since it's originating from the workstation, it's not worried about inbound traffic, which is typically where people focus for firewalls. So it doesn't impede the bot. It's where it's looking at outbound traffic. And that's why it could potentially be successful during our penetration test. So I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment and share my desktop. We'll do a demonstration of the software, and then we'll talk a little bit about why this is so successful when we're doing a lot of our pen tests. What you'll see here is that I'm currently logged into a private Jabber session using my IM client. And I'm the only person logged in here. And then I have a window that's into a chat room called bots. This is very typical of what you would see in a penetration test that we're doing when we're including social engineering. One of the things we'll do is trick a user into downloading an executable that then deploys the bot for us and then logs into the system to give us command and control over the workstation involved. So if you could bear with the small point in simulation in here where you're seeing this, we'll actually have the attacker and the person being attacked on the same computer, but it would be exactly the same type of process you would see if it was two different systems on here. But this allows us to see everything in one window during the screen share. So I'm in this room called bots, which is where we'll see the other user log into. So what you'll see is there's this executable here called patches.exe. This is the malware that was downloaded by the user onto the system. If you can imagine that they received an email saying they needed to install this software, download it, double-click it. It would be on their desktop or downloads folder. All I need to do is double-click, runs for a moment, and then you'll see this window pop up and says the update was completed successfully, and now there's a new attendee in the room. And if you look at the computer itself, there's no indication that it's running. You just said it was updated successfully, and in the background, hidden from the user, there is a connection maintained to our Jabber server that then allows us to communicate. So we can double-click. If you imagine, you could see during a test many remote bots in this participants list. We can just choose which one we want, double-click on them, and start talking. Now we have some minor security controls on here, even though it's a private server that we use for our command and control. But if we're using multiple pen tests, we would assign a password to each one for that test, so that we would log into to then gain control over it. So I'm going to type in the password in here. I can type that in real quick. Okay, so access has been granted. And then we can look at the set of commands that we are allowed to run. So there's a lot of different things that we can do on here, some of which helps us during our test in order to determine what we're trying to do. Some of the most useful ones give us a profile of the system. But since this is a standalone system, you won't get things like domain information, but we can run a profile on the system. If you look here, we get the computer name, the username of the person who's logged on, and then also the logon server. So this may be the domain controller, and it gives you a little bit of more information about the IP address and what is on the system. So for example, here we're seeing that it's a 192.168 subnet. It would give us an indication that this may be like a home network. In this case, it's a virtual machine running on my system, which is why it's running this. But you may see things that would indicate that you're on a corporate network, or you may be able to get an idea of where this person is. You can also look at the process listing, what's currently running on the system. So I type PS, I get a listing here. I see that there's a lot of different applications running. And then here's the bot here called neutron.exe. And I can also see things like PowerPoint is running and so forth. What I can do also is other enumeration that would be useful for me. I could run a command called services. This will give me another enumeration that would be useful. And it'll tell me what services are running on the system. So there's a listing here. I'm going to scroll back up to the top to show you. So it gives me some information here. Is the service started? What's the name of the service and who is it running as? So these are all just local service names, local system, and so forth. There's not any service here running as like a domain account. That may be something useful that we would look for when we're trying to attack a system. But it just gives us that set of enumeration. And then most importantly, the last thing we can do is execute commands. It wouldn't be useful to have a command and control bot unless we would be able to run commands and do different things. So we can do things with exec, dir, and this would take a directory listing locally, set net users. We take a look at the different users that are on the system. And this just gives me the ability to do things and execute commands and try to take over the system, or use this as a jump point into the network that I'm trying to attack. But if you notice, when I ran this, the antivirus didn't do anything. It didn't say, hey, this is malware. There wasn't anything that said this isn't supposed to connect out there. And I am running antivirus and the standard Windows firewall for this demo. Another thing I can do is show you that if I'm running GUI programs, it's capable of showing up. So I'm going to run Notepad. If I do an exec Notepad, I would be able to see this pop up. And we remedy that by creating another command called spawn. And what it does is it runs in the background. So I could have Notepad running, but it hides the window. So we could run GUI applications that may not be as useful for attacking in a normal instance, but we would want to run them. We can run them in the background by using the spawn command. And if I do a process listing, I can see that Notepad is running with this process ID, but I don't see it on the screen, so it's actually hidden. And if I want to terminate it because it's continuing to run and I don't want it, I can just issue a kill command with the process ID. And if I take the process listing again, you'll see that it is no longer in the list. So it offers a lot of flexibility. And one thing that's not enabled for this demo, we do have the ability to upload and download files. So we can upload files to a web server that we have. We can also get files that we place on a web server and bring down. So what it allows us to do is greatly expand the toolkit. So even though this is a Windows-based command and control bot, we may be able to move data back and forth that would be useful, for example, for attacking a Macintosh or a Unix box or an AS400. So we're able to then pull information in. And then if we gather information that's useful, we could then use this as the collection point and then upload it to the server that we can use for analysis from our systems. So it does give us a lot of flexibility there. And then, as I mentioned in the presentation, before doing the demo, this is a persistent bot. So it installs itself in the run key. So when the user logs in again after startup, it'll reattach and connect. So it maintains persistence across reboots, which is a key function in terms of creating a command and control channel. Since this is a penetration testing tool and not necessarily a malicious tool, we also enable the ability to have it register when it installed itself, and it checks after 30 days. If it hasn't been uninstalled, it automatically uninstalls itself and removes any traces that it was ever on the system. But instead of waiting for that time, we can just type uninstall, it removes itself, and if you can see here, it's now offline. Checking in the bots room, it's no longer there. So it's very clean in terms of being able to install and remove itself. So the question is, we mentioned that it's successful, but why is it so successful? And the reason for it is that there's this technical development of this tool, and it's not used in a widespread way. It's only used during our penetration tests. So it doesn't show up in the antivirus signatures is not typical of what you would see from a behavioral analysis, but that patches.exe still had to come down onto the computer. So there was also that avenue of social engineering when I talked about the user at the beginning. It's taking a couple of those breakdowns in the layers of security to implement this attack. So essentially, not only do you have this technical part, but you have to convince the user to put it onto the system. And the reason why we can get them to do that is because, in general, employees want to please their employers and be helpful. They want to do a good job. So we as social engineers try to appeal to this in order to get them to do what we want. So when we're trying to do it, we make up emails, we create websites, and we try to entice a user to then go there and pull that software down. So here's an example of an email that's sent, and it's kind of an eye chart on here, but we'll just read the general spirit of what the email is saying, that we're creating a remote access solution, and we're trying to help with remote access or remote office capability, and we're putting a new employee portal in place. It's being worked on, but we want people to test it. And it's going to help you on a day-to-day basis. You can go to this site with the link, log in with your Windows account, and click on the link at the top called portal. So it's basically telling you that, hey, we're trying to do something to make it easier for you, but in order to make sure this is successful, we need you to test it. And we tell you this works most of the time. It's not every time, but a good bit of the time, this particular tactic works, and people go to the website, they log in. Oh, it's great that they logged in because they also gave us the username and password. And then we tell them when they get there that they can't view the site correctly, and they need to download either a web components update or patches.exe, something that we have in order to then make them install the Trojan horse. So they click it, they download it, double-click it, and then double-click the executable, and then it connects into our command and control server. So that's just an example of how this software can show up on someone's system. So the big question is, we talked about the risks, but how do I prevent this attack? And let's look at this specific bot demo, because we want to be able to talk about, okay, this is great, it's successful, but how do we stop something like this from happening? First and foremost, in this particular attack vector, the user had to download and run the executable. So there's an end user awareness thing that has to be done, the user education. And the question is, how does a company communicate with their employees? Would they always see this type of email saying we're testing out a portal? Or would there be some sort of branding that would be done, or would it be followed up with a particular additional email or communication? A great example when doing one of our tests, when we actually got caught doing this, was that we found a company used a different color scheme in their logos. They didn't match what was on their website. So we were able to change their communication so that employees knew what an internal communication looked like versus a phishing attack. Is it something that would be 100% foolproof? No, but from an outsider's perspective, where we weren't aware of it, we were able to be detected in that fashion. And there's a lot of different ways that could be done. There may be a certain email box or certain syntax that's used for that email account, or just a particular person that may send that information out as opposed to a generic help desk account. So there may be different ways that you could effectively communicate to your employees so that they know that this is a legitimate communication versus a phishing attempt. And then also in this example, from a technical standpoint, there was no egress filtering. Outbound traffic is just as important as inbound. What you're sending out of the system is just as important as someone trying to connect maliciously. So as painful as it may seem at times, you may want to configure the host-based firewall to prompt for new user connections going outbound. Not every time, because then it becomes nuisanceware and people just become conditioned to clicking OK. But when a new program is trying to go outside, ask the user for authorization and click OK. And that could be reinforced with the user education to say, if this comes up, it's important. So make sure you understand what you're doing before you click OK. And in general, as mentioned at the beginning, it's defense in depth. Utilize multiple technologies. You should expect at least one failure in technologies. For example, the custom malware that was there, the zero-day exploit. Understand from the tool set that you choose how one tool will cover for another failure, and understand where your weaknesses are, and then work to bolster strength in where those weaknesses are, whether that's changing the technology or user education, or make sure that the configuration is up to date so that it gives you the best chance to help prevent this type of attack. And also keep all software up to date using your patch management processes, making sure that there isn't a particular vulnerability that's out there, understanding where the risks are, and then applying those updates into the systems. And then working with the user access at least privileged. Mentioning at the beginning that a lot of users have administrative access over the system. That tends to be a user comfort level piece, or it tends to be something that, from a conversation, we always allowed our users to have administrative access and we can't take it away now. Or there may be software that isn't written well that requires write access to different places where their solution is to recommend administrative access. There are ways to be able to profile those applications, give users access to what they need to, deploy packages for them to install software so that they don't have to have administrative access, and that greatly reduces the exposure in terms of what can be done on the system. It may not prevent a breach from occurring, but it may help prevent a widespread propagation of that attack or slow it down. But again, by allowing the users to have least privilege, it does reduce the risk there. And lastly, mentioned user education. Again, end users are a prime target for intrusions. A lot of the high-profile breaches that you've seen recently, heard in the news, have been as a result of end users either clicking on links, installing software, doing some myriad of tasks that they weren't supposed to do, and then allowed that initial foothold into a workplace that the breach then occurs. I find that the most important way to try to get the message across is to tie it to personal stakes, related to how these types of practices that are good to have in the workplace are also good to use at home in order to help prevent identity theft, protecting your identity, protecting your credit card and your financial information. So it kind of moves you from this is only what you're doing for the company into this is the good practice to have in life. And also, you get that side benefit of protecting yourself, but you're also helping protect the company that you work for. Tying that personal stake is very important. I think it kind of pushes you the extra mile in terms of the user education process, and therefore gets a better acceptance and retention of what's being done in that class. And also to tell those users that it's better to ask questions and call IT. There's a lot of people who think this may not be the right thing to do, but they're either afraid or don't know what they need to do. They're maybe afraid to call the help desk. Maybe they don't know how to call the help desk. It's just a matter of reiterating on a regular basis. It's better to ask questions, and that's what everybody's there for. We're here to help you. If you don't know what's going on here, something looks shady, or you don't want to install software, you don't want to do this, just call IT, call the help desk, and we will assist you. And then that may raise the alert level and be able to let security or IT then put a protection in place in order to help stop the phishing attack as it's going on. And then in terms of user education, use examples. Sometimes when you talk theoretically about these types of exploits, people tend to say, well, yes, I know that can happen, but is it really going to happen to me? Well, yes, it could happen to you, and using those examples. So if you are doing penetration tests on a regular basis, you don't necessarily have to share their report with them, but talk about how the social engineering exercise allowed the testing firm to gain access into different things and how you're working to mitigate that. It's a matter of trying to put that balance between the secrecy of the report to sharing some of the information about how this works and how someone was able to either get into the building or get into a system based off of the social engineering that was done. And having those examples are very important in terms of being able to kind of emphasize how real the risks are as opposed to theoretical. And then also tied to current security trends in the news. Talk about other companies in your industry that have had issues or what's been going on in terms of what the security trend is. Hey, we're aware that there's this new type of malware. People send email out. You're able to click on these links and do things. This is a real thing. Look, these companies had this happen. Let's not let it happen to us. So it's just a matter of trying to make sure that there's a lot of different avenues being used in terms of user education for making sure that people become aware of what's going on and they kind of keep the information fresh. So being able to use those examples is pretty important. That tying it back to the personal stakes and also making sure that they know that it's not just technical, that there's also this other part that they play. They have to know that everybody plays a part in security. So again, user education is probably one of the most important things you can do, because once you give users access, they could potentially give access to the attacker next. And then the last thing is, what happens if all else fails? What happens if there is a breach? So when we talk about layers, right, there's these preventative measures. And then there's these other measures that you can put in place that allow you to then move forward and say, all right, we did have maybe a first level breach or a total breach occur. How do we know that it's happening? Is it something that happened in the past? Is it in process? What are we doing? So the first part is looking at monitoring and alerting. So these are the types of things where you're getting alarms. You're getting some sort of email. There's some alert that would happen to say, this is unusual activity. We were seeing unusual things coming out of these endpoints, or now it's coming from a server because the endpoint moved over to a server, and we need something to review. And that's where you look at your corporate IDS, or maybe aggregate of logs on endpoint intrusion detection, host-based intrusion detection systems, and other types of software. Log the user activities for review. It doesn't mean every keystroke and mouse click necessarily, but what are the different things that are happening? Even different systems allow different levels of granularity, and it may be important to log those different activities to see if it's unusual. On Tuesday, it was different than what happens every other day, and that's when we saw other unusual activity. This allows for correlation between events in order to help build a timeline. If something's in process, it may help mitigate the spread of a breach, but at the same time, if it's afterwards, at least a timeline can be built. And that can all be done through developing incident response capabilities. The worst thing you can possibly do is try to develop a capability as you go along in an incident response. And this can be done through different things like tabletop exercises, scenario planning, understanding who those people are that would be playing key roles in an incident response. Who are those members? A lot of times people think, oh, it's just technical. We're going to look at systems. We're going to review logs. We're going to do these things. But there's important pieces in the technical or in the incident response team that are non-technical. Executives that need to make key decisions for the business about where they're going to go. Getting legal guidance from internal legal or external counsel. And public relations. If it is a high-profile type of situation, you want to be able to control the response, what it looks like, how it works, the timeliness of it. It's very important to make sure that everybody is working together in concert. So not only is there this team, but there's also the command center and how those work. And by doing this in an exercise before going into an incident, which hopefully you don't have, but if you do have an incident you have to deal through, you understand who the players are, how things work, how you would go about going through the incident as quickly and crisply as possible, trying to mitigate any further issue that comes from it. And then also have in those exercises, you would have detailed plans for different situations, and what that would help with is containing and cleaning up afterwards. So there's what's happening during, you try to contain it, but then afterwards you need to be able to put either different systems back in place, different operations back in place. You need to make sure it's being done cleanly. And that would include not only getting things to normal operating order, but also making sure that whatever the original hole was has been closed up so that it doesn't happen again. The worst thing that you can have is a breach. You put everything, you've gone through it, you put everything back in place, and then it immediately happens again because the original issue was never found and never fixed. So that's a very important part of it too, is being sure that not only can you respond in an appropriate fashion, but then clean up afterwards.